Okay, this is the second video for class 4. In the first video, I talked about social epistemology in general, and then I introduced the idea of testimonial injustice. Social epistemology is the study of how we create knowledge in groups, and testimonial injustice is a way that we can fail to create knowledge because information does not travel along social networks. More specifically, testimonial injustice happens when someone is not believed because of who they are, or alternatively, someone is believed too much because of who they are. The goal of the rest of this class is going to be to talk about testimonial injustice. But before we do that, we have to talk about power. So going into this video, you should have already done the exercise on testimonial injustice. And now to talk about that exercise, I'm going to cut over to a video I shot for this class last year with one slight adjustment. So I asked you to describe a time when you weren't believed, even though you were right. And this could be a big thing, it could be a small thing, but just, an example from your own life that so that you can get a emotional sense of the issue we're talking about. And then I asked two questions. Why weren't you believed? And did this feel morally unjust to you? And I imagine, depending upon how you answer that second question, it's going to change how you answer the third question. But for some people, they're going to feel like the reasons they weren't believed were really just unfair, and that by being doubted, you felt disrespected, you felt slighted, you felt like someone thought you less than a full-fledged person. So, and that's not going to happen with every example, but it might happen with all kinds of examples. It's going to happen with some of them. So what we're talking about when that happens is what we're going to call a testimonial injustice. And just as a first approximation, not a technical definition, we're just going to say that a testimonial injustice is the wrong that happens when one's assertions are not believed for irrelevant reasons. So you say something, you make an assertion, you know it's true, but people doubt you for stupid reasons, and that feels like wrong. Interestingly, testimonial injustice can also happen when people are believed too much. But first, let's talk about power. People, especially in America, are uncomfortable talking about power relationships in individual one-on-one relationships. We don't like to acknowledge that there are power dynamics at play a lot of times. And that's unfortunate because sometimes to really understand what's going on between two people, you really need to understand power. So the reading that we had is about testimonial injustice, but you may have been kind of surprised to discover that the first part of the reading was not about testimony, and it wasn't about justice, it was about power. And that's because we need to understand power relationships between individuals in order to understand the phenomenon we're looking at. One piece of metacognition that is always going on in our brains, at least a little, when we are talking to people, is that we are constantly monitoring our relationship with that person and how much we like them and trust them. This is especially true when we don't know someone very well, but it happens in established relationships too. And this sense of how much we like someone often affects how we evaluate the things they tell us. This is something we'll talk about more in the argument section when we talk about arguments from authority and testimony and ad hominem attacks. one thing that we'll see there is that when we let how much we like someone affect whether we think the things they are saying are true, it leaves us vulnerable to people like salesmen. Salesmen use their likability to get you to buy things you don't need. But there's something even deeper going on here. Your evaluation of people over evidence can lead to what we're calling testimonial injustice. Sometimes a person's testimony is distorted by the social power of the speaker and the audience. So to understand how social power gets distorted, to understand how testimony gets distorted, we need to understand social power. So this is a part of the general discussion in this critical thinking course about social epistemology, because one of my ideas going into the design of this course is that a lot of what appear to be failures of critical thinking that we see in society right now, and in particular, I've been talking about the anti-vax movement as an example of a failure of critical thinking. A lot of that is driven not by a sudden inability of people to think critically, but by problems with the flow of information, right? Right now, a lot of problems in the United States are coming because information is not flowing properly. So this discussion of testimonial injustice sits straight in the middle of that topic. Problems with information flow right now. So we need to talk about social power. So let's talk about it. Social power is power to change things in the social world. That seems straightforward enough. It helps actually to have a contrast in mind. Whenever you define one thing, it becomes easier if you think about what it's not. So a contrast here could be physical power, which would be power to change things in the physical world. So my standard example of physical reality and social reality when I teach these classes is the difference between the Rio Grande and the Texas-Mexico border. The Rio Grande is physical reality. It is a moving body of water, right? It's actually a part of a causal cycle, the water cycle. That is something that exists whether or not we believe in it. The Texas-Mexico border happens to be in the same place as the Rio Grande, but that is social reality. It is a product of the relationship between two governments. And you can do one set of actions to have power over the physical reality, changing the course of the river, and a different set of actions will give you power over the social reality, changing the border between the two countries. So what we're talking about now is the power, but specifically the kind of power that allows us to change social realities and social relationships. Now, one of the first things that Fricker does in exploring the idea of social power is to distinguish active from passive uses of power. And I think this is a really important example, so I want to dive into this. So her example here is actually a police officer, a traffic cop, right? And police officers can use their social power actively. And so the example here is writing a speeding ticket. So if a police officer gives you a speeding ticket, they have, among other things, changed social reality. They've changed physical reality by writing something on a piece of paper, but that's kind of incidental. The big thing is the change in social reality, because now you owe money, and you may have to show up in court. Those are social obligations. So a police officer writing a speeding ticket is an active use of power because an individual has changed the social world through their deliberate action. Most of the time, when people exercise power, they don't do it actively, they do it passively. So think about what happens when you're driving down the road, when you're driving down I-90, for instance, that I was just driving down, and you see a police car parked in the median. Everyone slows down, right? The police haven't done anything active to make people slow down. There may not even be anyone in that car. Nevertheless, people slow down because they know that there is a potential for action there. The social world is changing because people know that the police have the potential to use their power actively and write a speeding ticket. So most of the time, actually, when people have social power, they're using it passively. And often, when people actively use social power, their primary goal isn't to change that one bit of the one thing that they're changing, but to renew their social power, to renew their passive power. That is, if you didn't see police actively writing speeding tickets routinely, you would begin to think that the threat of having a cop write you a speeding ticket was an empty threat. So in order to maintain the ability to use power passively, you need to occasionally use power actively in order to show that your threat is not an empty threat, right? So that's active power and passive power through a simple example, the police writing a speeding ticket. We also want to talk about agential power and structural power. And this is a topic that I deal with a lot in classes, and I haven't dealt with it much in the critical thinking class, but it's useful to think about a contrast between power that comes from a single individual and power that comes from a larger social structure. So in, for instance, my ethics class and my bioethics class, we talk about individual injustice and structural injustice. Individual injustice is when one person is unfair. For instance, if I'm assigning grades, I could decide to do that unfairly by, for instance, taking bribes. Structural injustice is something that comes not from an individual's actions, but from large social institutions that many people participate in. That's the idea of structural injustice that I get from Iris Marion Young, a political philosopher. But now we want to think, we're not talking about justice quite yet, we just want to talk about power. So we can talk about individual power and structural power. Let's return to the example of a police car, of a policeman. A police car shows up and another driver slows down. So, for instance, you're driving down the road and coming on an on-ramp is a policeman. He pulls in. He's now in front of you. You slow down. You decide not to pass him. You don't want to be seen driving faster than he is. So that's an exercise of power between individuals. It's passive, but it's agential in that the one individual is doing it. Structural power comes not from an individual's actions, but group actions, and government actions are easy examples here. So if a building code mandates that a building be handicapped accessible, that is an exercise of structural power. It's a move by the government, which is a body that many, many people participate in. And often this, they will mandate some forms of accessibility and not others. So they may have a ramp to get in, but they may not demand wider corridors, something like that. That is a social structure. All sorts of people cooperate with this. So it's not just the government who writes the laws. There are consultants, architects, building consultants who had lobbied the government for some changes and not others. And then there are building inspectors, and there are architects who build buildings. This is a huge, complicated social issue But it all winds up exerting power just as much as agental power does. And in fact, in some ways, structural power is always around in a way that agental power isn't. So let's talk about grading for a second. Your grade in a course is a bit of social reality. I mean, it's represented on pieces of paper or bits on a computer, but fundamentally it is something that exists because social institutions and individuals acknowledge it, like the Texas-Mexico border exists because governments acknowledge it, right? So your grade is social reality. A teacher, in being able to assign grades, has social power, and that's agental because it's just the individual's power. But hang on, my social power to apply grades actually requires the cooperation of others. I mean, it may be on the surface individual power, but there's also a structural element behind it. I can enter grades on the computer all day long, but that will mean nothing unless it is made official by the college and taken seriously by employers and other institutions. So although I've got social power in the ability to assign grades, that social power exists because there is a structure that cooperates with it, right? And if the structure rejects me, if I get fired, I can enter grades all day long and no one will care. It's just me typing letters on a computer. It's because my agental power is tied to structural power. So now we are able to discuss social power in a more concrete way. And this is how Fricker defines it in your reading. Social power is the practically socially situated capacity to control others' actions. Changing social reality means controlling others' actions, where this capacity might be exercised actively or passively by individual agents, or alternatively, it may operate purely structurally. So, power is ability to control other people's actions, and it is exercised in many ways. A key form of social power that Fricker wants to talk about is identity power. Identity power is social power based on shared imaginative conceptions of the social identity of the person exercising power and the person subject to it. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Well, let's first of all think about what kinds of identities she means. The ones that are central to her essay are things like race and gender. So her two main examples are fictional, actually. The Talented Mr. Ripley and To Kill a Mockingbird. In each case, people's testimony is doubted because of their social identity. In the one case, someone is doubted because they're a woman, and in another case, someone is doubted because they are black. So this is a particular use of social power. And it comes not just from, any old kind of structure, but it happens because both the person exercising power and the person being influenced by power share an understanding of social roles. So in the example from The Talented Mr. Ripley, where the father figure says to the woman, "Oh, look, there's female intuition and then there's facts." He is actively asserting gender roles there, and it works because both parties, they don't necessarily believe in the gender roles, but they understand that those gender roles dominate their society. And this is what actually Fricker calls a shared imaginative conception. right? And there are other kinds of identity that might be relevant here. One that Fricker uses frequently as a contrast is people's academic specialties, right? Is someone a doctor? Is someone a philosopher? Is someone an engineer? And those are social identities that have a lot of images caught up with them. There are shared imaginative conceptions there. Fricker tends to think that they are less morally significant than things like race and gender because they have less overall impact on people's the outcomes of people's lives. So here are some things we can say. Identity power can be active or passive. So in the talented Mr. Ripley example, the father figure was being active in reminding the woman of her social role, but he could also do it. He could also serve that role passively, just by being an older dude, right, and projecting that kind of identity. Although notice again that passive power depends on being actively used sometimes. So it's extremely important in patriarchal power relationships that the dominant party, the man, periodically actually use the kind of privilege that comes from male identity, or assert it somehow in order to remind people who's in charge. The other thing to note is that active identity power can be used consciously or unconsciously. So Fricker emphasizes in the example from the talented Mr. Ripley that the person who says, oh, well, Marge, there's female intuition and then there's fact, may not even consciously be aware that they are exercising power over someone. That's just some dumb shit they say all the time. Nevertheless, it is an exercise of power. And the other thing is that identity power can be used maliciously or benignly. By all accounts, the guy asserting his identity power in the example actually is not being malicious, because if he knew actually that what the woman was saying was true, that would be important information to him. It's about a murderer. It's been a while since I watched the movie. So in any case, all this returns us to the idea of testimonial injustice. Because identity power, either used actively or passively, either coming structurally or agentally, affects how often people are believed. And this phenomenon is pervasive. So the last slide I've got for this is just a quote from the from the reading about how it is that identity power can work, even in interesting situations where, for instance, neither party believes in the stereotypes being evoked, but nevertheless the identity power is still at work. So what Fricker says is, both parties must share a relevant conception of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, where such conceptions amount to stereotypes. For instance, women are irrational. Fricker also notes that these stereotypes may or may not be distorting. For instance, you might think that the stereotype that women are more caring than men because of the role in childbirth is not distorting. You might think it is, you might think it's not. It doesn't matter whether it's distorting. The point is that it is a stereotype that is there. And these stereotypes impact men and women's respective authority on this or that subject matter, right? And the stereotypes can be at work even if you don't actually believe them. So, I'll just read here. Note that the operation of identity power does not require that either party consciously accept the stereotype as truthful. If we were to interpret Marge as thoroughly aware of the distorting nature of the stereotype used to silence her, it would still be no surprise that she is silenced by it. And part of that's going to be, if I can just extrapolate here, remembering active uses of power, where in fact people enforce gender norms, perhaps even violently, right? So conceptions of different different social identities that are activated in the operations of identity power need not be held at the level of belief in either subject or object, for the primary modus operandi of identity power is at the level of collective social imagination. Consequently, it can control our actions even despite our beliefs. Okay, so now before we go on to talk about about testimonial injustice itself, I've got a second exercise that asks you to fill in, to apply these ideas about power and identity power. So you're just asked to come up with an example, either real or made up, of identity power, and then flesh out how it's working in that case. Is it agental, or is it structural? Is it active or passive? And again, the idea here is just to give you sort of an emotional anchor for understanding power relationships that can help you then as we explore the core idea here, which is testimonial injustice.